Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here tonight. I am Lesnik, one lawyer,
And I am Westbrook. I'm one therapist.
and
And we are going to
together,
have one heck of a conversation.
one heck of a conversation. Over the past few weeks, there's been new procedural developments in the Tepe case, formal charges, indictments, and additional information released through court filings. As is typical at this stage, those documents provide more detail about what investigators believe have happened, but they do not and cannot tell us everything. Tonight, me and Tabitha are here to talk about coercive control and domestic violence as it relates to the Tepe case. I want to be very clear about what tonight is and what tonight is not. We are not here to give legal advice, and we are not here to diagnose anyone. We are not here to try this case outside of a courtroom. We are here to talk about patterns, that Tabitha and I see show up again and again in coercive control and domestic violence and post-separation abuse cases, and patterns that many survivors recognize immediately in their bodies, even when the public is still trying to make sense of what has happened. One of the things that stands out in cases like this is that there is often very little visible record of abuse. No police reports, no protective orders, no public filings. And I want to say this clearly at the outset. The absence of records is not the absence of danger or domestic abuse. Many survivors never report. Many disclose only privately to a few family and friends, if they disclose at all. But silence is often not peace. Many times it feels like survival for the victims. So tonight, with the help of my friend, trauma therapist, Tabitha Westbrook, we're going to explore why cases like the Tepe case can be so destabilizing for survivors, what coercive control actually looks like behind closed doors, and what lessons survivors can take, not in fear, but in discernment and self-protection. So, Tabitha, first of all, I'd like you to introduce yourself. And then from a trauma perspective, why do cases like this resonate so deeply with survivors?
Yeah, so I'm Tabitha Westbrook. I am a licensed trauma therapist, but this is not trauma therapy. We are just talking through the case and talking through it from a domestic abuse and coercive control lens. I do want to say before we dive in, take care of you. We are going to be talking about some really hard topics here, and it's really important for you to take care of yourself. So if you're like, I am noticing my body feel some kind of way, or I am starting to feel all kinds of upside down, take a step away. This is going to be out here on the YouTubies, and you can always come back to it when you're ready. So you are the only you that you have. You need to take care of you. Also, before we dive in, make sure you like and subscribe. That
Yes.
really helps out the channel. It helps out our talks, and it's really important for us so that people who need to hear this information can get to it. So why does this case capture the imagination of survivors? Well, I think lots of folks think that could have been me, or it could be me, or I don't want that to be me. And it seemed like, by all intents and purposes. So for the people who have not heard of the case, we are talking about a double homicide of Monique and Spencer Tepe. They had been married about 5 years, had 2 kiddos, and lived in the Columbus, Ohio area. And overnight, I believe it was right around the Christmas time. It was right after Christmas.
It was,
Someone
December 30th, right before New Year's Eve.
Right before New Year's Eve. So someone entered their home and murdered them both. And they were found after Spencer, who was a dentist, didn't show up at work the next day. And people became worried because that was very much out of character. And that's when the homicide was discovered. So this has captured people's imaginations, I think, because it looked like, Monique had gotten past the harm of her previous relationship. It looked like she had a new life and things were going well. They had a good, job and good house and great kids. And by all reports from family members, they were happy. And so I think when survivors see this, they feel absolutely awful for her and for what happened. And their hearts grieve because they know it could be, it could have been them. Like, they have a similar story. They know what it's like to be an abuse survivor. And they also are like, oh my goodness, what about my situation? Could this happen to me? One of the biggest questions I've heard about this case in particular is, the alleged criminal is her ex-husband. They were married for a very short period of time, about 7 months. I think it was about 14 months total until they were fully divorced. It was a private divorce, so it wasn't adjudicated out in open court and that sort of thing. They didn't have a ton of assets and they didn't have kids. So it seemed like things were done. However, after the homicides, it has come out that he was allegedly abusive toward her and that he continued to stalk her even after their divorce was final. So that, I think, is another thing. And people are like, well, it was 8 years. I mean, like, they were only married a short period of time and it's been 8 years. What in the world? What would cause someone to do this? And I think that's really where you and I, Tiffany, were like, let's lean into this. Because for us, as folks who work in this particular space, we were like, well, yeah, that tracks for sure.
Right.
And
yeah, no, absolutely.
It's not uncommon for abuse. First of all, 90% of individuals who are abused, the abuse continues even after separation or divorce. 90%. The majority of the individuals are women. And so, while that's not a one-to-one, it's not an always, it's a very often. And so we see this take place over time. And I know, Tiffany, you see this in the courtroom quite often.
Yeah. And what Tabitha and I hope to do tonight is talk a little bit about the characteristics of coercive controllers. And one of the things that I see very frequently as a domestic violence attorney, but also as a survivor myself, I found this with my own abuser, is the amount of time, energy, and effort that they put into, at times, surveilling, paying attention to what you're doing, monitoring your social media, where you're going, your cell phone, your activities, the amount of time that they invest in paying attention to what you're doing and what you're up to in many cases is exorbitant. I've never really understood that, why there is such an obsession with the victim, why I need to invest so much time in her whereabouts, what she's up to, what she's doing. I only can reduce that to power and control, right? I've got to have power and control over her every move and where she's at. I don't know, Tabitha, if you have anything to add to that from a clinical perspective or from your own personal observations or professional observations.
Yeah, absolutely. Oftentimes, coercive controllers see the victim as property. It is alleged in this particular case. And again, we're going to tell you some of the things that have been reported. They have not been proven in a court of law. So everyone is innocent until proven guilty. I just want to say that clearly. So I'm just going to talk about what's been reported out in the media. And these are all allegations. And we won't know until it goes to court and it goes to trial and we see the evidence come out, amongst a jury of his peers. So I just want to say that very clearly in this. But one of the things that we know, from reports that has allegedly been stated is that he had told Monique, you will always be my wife. I'll buy the house next to you. And that is evidence of seeing someone as a possession. A lot of times the way that I describe it is abusers see their victims as a couch that can make sandwiches and in the bedroom a blow up doll, because you're depersonalized. You are just a means to their end. There's a very strong sense of entitlement and coercive control. And that is really the heart of an abusive individual. From a faith-based perspective, we often say, that it is the heart that Satan had when he said, I will sit on the throne and be like the Most High. He wanted to be God. And that is the attitude that we very often see in a coercive controller. And a lot of folks will say, well, maybe it's their trauma and maybe it's not intentional. And I've done enough work with perpetrators of abuse to tell you it is 100% intentional. They have flatly to my face told me that it is intentional. And it isn't their trauma, though they may have trauma. And I'm not saying that trauma doesn't play a role, but it's not causative, right? It's correlative, which means those two things happen together, but one doesn't necessarily cause the other. And that's a really important thing to understand, because how many people in this world have lots and lots of trauma and they do not go on to coercively control another individual? And so we have to look deeper than that. And it's truly a sense of entitlement. And so when you see someone as property and they have moved on with their life and things are looking good, then they definitely are going to go, oh, I don't like that. And we see that where, they disrupt jobs, they disrupt relationships. It is not uncommon for a coercive controller to try to get their spouse or former spouse fired from a position or make it so that the company doesn't want to keep them. There's all kinds of stuff that happens.
And so we know from the recent investigation that Dr. Michael McKee, who is a vascular surgeon, was spotted outside of the Tepe residence on December 6, 2025. So that was shortly before the killings took place on December 30th, 2025. And he was seen outside of the Tepe residence for several hours, seeming to do or surveillance of sorts outside around the yard and the perimeter of the home. And then kind of disappears for a while, reports say. And so it seems that he came to the house on December 6th for a purpose, right? It's not purposeless. And there's also been reports that Monique and Spencer were at a football game, and she left at halftime because she was so upset about something related to her ex-husband that occurred on that exact same day. So they don't really know whether he had communication with her, whether he told her, I'm at the house, or again, I'm going to buy a house for the next 3 years. I will be with you forever. You're never going to get away from me. I could kill you if I want to. We don't know what was communicated. That information has not been released yet. But the information that has been released is that on December 6th, 2025, just a few short weeks before the murders took place, he was present on their property. And so we do know that if that is true, and that is the case, that he was there, that he was certainly surveilling or potentially stalking her in some format. And, did he know that I believe she was in Indiana at a football game? Like, it was a Big Ten football game. I'm not a huge football fan. Sorry about that. So I'm not well versed on my football verbiage, but I believe it was the Big Ten football game, maybe in Indiana. And so did he know that she wasn't home at the time, which gave him the ability to get whatever information he needed to get? But we do see, I think Tabitha sees, I see as an attorney, and I see in my personal work as well, stalking behavior at times. Right now, I will ask you, Tabitha, stalking behavior of this type, right? So when they divorced in 2017, it is now 2025, almost 2026. So almost a decade later, right? Is that typical?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, the research shows that continued attempts at coercive control can happen for months to decades. And it's more common when they have kids, so it is a little less common to see it when there are no children involved. But when a coercive controller has decided, you are my property, it's very difficult for them to let that go unless they choose to really change. And sadly, many of them, usually between 2 and 10%, will choose to change. And so the likelihood of them getting help, making changes, is unfortunately really limited, though we always hope that they will. And so it can be really challenging, to wrap your head around this, right? Because you're like, go do something else, bro. And we know from reports that he allegedly had other girlfriends in these times, but obviously never remarried. And so you're like, do you not have anything better to do with your life, man? And we are trying to apply logic to an illogical situation. And there's just no way. We are not playing with the same playbook if we, are trying to understand that. And so, while we don't see these cases escalate to murder as often, we do see them continue. A lot of times it's really hard for victims to get help. I mean, there are tons of stories out there of victims being stalked for years and law enforcement doing nothing because maybe they stood in the public street and stared at their house, and maybe they didn't make an overt threat. And so it's really hard. I tell clients this all the time. There is a difference between immorality and illegality at times. Sometimes they match up. It's really helpful when that happens. And sometimes they don't. And so if they haven't escalated to the point that something is illegal or there is no coercive control laws in a state, then it's really hard for law enforcement to take action. So a lot of law enforcement isn't as well trained as I would like to see in this area. But even if they are, if there is no law to enforce, hence the term law enforcement, there's not a lot that they can do. And that's where, from the advocacy perspective, we are working to try to change laws to include more coercive control language and that sort of thing. We are seeing states pick that up, but goodness, it is really hard. And so we can see this take place for long periods of time.
Right. Let me ask you this. What if he had moved on? So let's say he had gotten remarried, right? Or was in a new relationship. Does that change the stalking behavior of coercive controllers over time? Do we see any differences between someone who maybe has gotten into a new relationship versus someone such as Dr. McKee, who was single, maybe dating, but not in a serious committed relationship as far as we know? And it also sounds like he had some occupational issues. It sounds like he bounced from hospital to hospital and maybe had some complaints, some professional complaints as well. So if a coercive controller kind of moves on and they have a new relationship, they have a focus of attention somewhere else, might we see a discontinuation or a de-escalation of stalking behavior?
Yes and no. It depends, right? This is the therapist answer of all time. It depends is always a great answer. Sometimes yes, but often no. And I think that also surprises people. Well, they've got another honey. Like, why? What are they bored? What are we doing? And again, you have to understand they see the victim as property. And when your couch decides to tell you, no, I don't want to do this anymore, this isn't okay, you're going to be mad about it. Now, again, to someone who is not a coercive controller, that makes absolutely zero sense. And you're like, this is so dumb. And I agree, it's not real helpful, but that is the mentality. So they still think that they own you. And it's especially pronounced if there are children. In this case, there were not children involved in the initial relationship. But I imagine it would have been even more profound had there been children involved. And so, especially if things are not going well, and a lot of coercive controllers will blame other people for their problems. Like they are like, it is all you. I can't tell you how many I have worked with who have said, well, if it wasn't for my ex-wife's narcissism, and you're like, she's not a narcissist, bro, or if it was, or like the world is unfair to me. And again, it's that sense of entitlement we talked about at the very beginning of this discussion that is permeating through what they believe. So everything is everyone else's fault. Unless it's a good thing, then it's all theirs. And so that is part of what we see, taking place in these continued behaviors. So I work with lots of clients where their, ex, has gotten remarried and is still stalking them and harassing them.
Right. And I think especially if you have children with a coercive controller, the children gives them the means to continue to harass you throughout your children's lives rather than just following you. That's what I see as an attorney anyway, or through the legal process. Right. So it gives them that fuel. I say that coercive controllers, I know the old word was narcissist. Now we've moved to coercive controllers. I still kind of use the word narcissist because I like it, but chaos and confusion, and especially your confusion and your reactivity to that, to them is like a drug. When they get you all upset, it feeds them, right? It's like a drug to them. And so, for them to be able to get you all worked up and upset, whatever means they need to do that, whatever means they need to do that, is fuel for them. And so, and one of the ways that we can minimize their behavior is not feeding that. not feeding that fire with additional fuel, right? So we don't know what kind of interactions Monique, Tepe, and Dr. McKee were having. Right? That information hasn't come to light yet. The record just doesn't reflect the reality of the relationship that they had, right? We're getting glimpses of what happened. But she never filed any police reports. She never filed any protective orders or restraining orders. The court file, their divorce file, doesn't really reveal anything. I mean, it's very benign pleadings. There's nothing salacious or nothing in the pleadings themselves that suggests that he was abusive or that they had any problems in their marriage. Just, again, very short-lived marriage between the two of them. And so I think, Tabitha, let's talk about, does the record in domestic abuse cases reflect the reality of trauma victims?
No, there's a million reasons that you wouldn't have any type of legal activity related to domestic abuse and coercive control. And that's because sometimes, like I said, it doesn't rise to the level of illegality. It's immoral, but it is not illegal. Or there are good reasons. You may think I'm not going to be heard, or perhaps you have been dismissed by law enforcement. You've gone perhaps and attempted to make a complaint, and the police said there's nothing we can do. Even if they could, sometimes they do miss it, like in the Gabby Petito case, where they were just not educated and didn't lean in the way that they could have. There's a lot of different things that would mean it doesn't end up in the court record. And oftentimes, and it looks like this from the paper trail that we currently have for Monique, was that it was like, let's just get out. Let me get out. And so she just got it done in the least abrasive way possible. And if you have someone who is like, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to take you out, this is going to end badly for you, you might just be like, look, I just want to get out. I'm going to cause the least amount of trouble I can. I'm going to go. And so they used a private judge to adjudicate everything so it could just be done. And she didn't ask for there are some reports that maybe she didn't ask for things that she might have been legally entitled to. And that says to me, if that is true, and again, we won't know until it goes to court, that she was like, let me just go. And I've seen that in my own clients. I don't want anything. I want to he can have the house. He can have all the assets. He can have the retirement. I got to go. I just got to get out. And so they think by doing that they're going to cause less waves and it'll be safer. And sometimes that's true. Right. And, it's so unpredictable, right? Not all domestic abusers, end up taking out their ex-spouse. However, it does happen, and it happens more often than we think. I think this case is illustrative of that. But sometimes it's just like, let me make as few waves as possible and just get out safe. And people do that.
I see that also in my practice. Many of my female clients are just want to forfeit, right, all of their future financial rights in order just to have freedom from the abuser. And many times that's a myth because, as we've seen, many times they continue the abusive behavior even after separation. And then the client is just left with no financial resources in order to defend themselves against the continued abuse that occurs. And so one thing I've also noticed with court systems and the legal system, and what I try to help educate women is that courts are reactive. They're not proactive. Right. So unfortunately, the courts have a tendency to wait until something happens. Right. So we wait until he actually becomes abusive. Right. He strikes you, or he does threaten you, or he does eventually harm you in some significant way. Unfortunately, for Monique Tepe, that was the kind of the final act for her. But then it triggers the court's attention. And the one thing I'll say for me, Tabitha, that really just confounds me. So I'm a civil attorney. I am a family law. I am a domestic violence attorney. And it confuses folks sometimes because they think domestic violence is criminal, and it can be, right? So domestic violence is both civil and it's criminal. So if you file for a restraining order or a protective order, that is a civil matter, right? You're filing a civil case or a civil action. However, if you have a protective order or a restraining order and he violates that protective order or restraining order, that then is a criminal matter, right? He's going to be charged criminally for violation of that order. So it can be two separate things. The one thing that confounds me when I go before civil judges is they have a tendency to they rotate in the criminal court, right? So they're in front of these guys, right, who commit murders, who commit rapes, who commit these heinous offenses, who are very dangerous people. But somehow when we get into family court or domestic violence court, we have these blinders on. Like somehow only those people across the street in courtroom B exist over there, but in courtroom A across the street on the left-hand side in the civil courthouse, we can't possibly have real violent people over here. Like this is a different population. And I'm like, no, we need to open our eyes, right? Mm-hmm. These are the same people across the street that we have here, and they pose a threat and a danger, right, to victims and children. And we need to be aware of that. I don't know if you have any commentary on that or not, but that's something that frustrates the heck out of me as a family law and domestic violence attorney.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think part of it is there is still this faulty belief that it is a high conflict relationship and there's some level of mutuality to it. And that's just simply not the case. Abuse by its very definition and coercive control by its definition is a power over. So only one person can have power over. You can't have two people with power over or it doesn't work, right? And so by thinking, oh, it's a relationship problem, they're just high conflict, it's toxic, you're not going to see it in the right way versus when you look at it from the power and control dynamics. And that's really what I think the court system is missing. You know, they come in and usually the victim is quite dysregulated and, you know, because her entire nervous system is on fire. I mean, if you're in danger, wouldn't yours be? And so maybe she doesn't, you know, and we're using some gendered terminology just because of this case, but it can be, you know, where men are victims of abuse. So I just want to state that clearly. But the victim comes in with their neurology on fire. They're maybe not able to present the most cogent case. They're often financially controlled, so they don't have you know, maybe resources to retain an attorney. Oftentimes they are pro se, which means they're representing themselves. And so they just don't have the resources oftentimes to present a strong case. And the judge looks at them and goes, man, you're a mess. Well, I can see why, you know, he's saying none of this is true and all of that. And man, abusive individuals will get on the stand and lie. And we can, you know, and I know so many of us, I know me personally, I'd be like, how could you do that? Like, I can't lie to anybody, let alone in court where I've made an oath. But they don't have any problem saying things that aren't true. And so then that just regulates the victim further, and then the court case doesn't go forward. I like to put it this way, like my friend Leslie Vernick says, abuse is not a relationship problem, it causes them. And I think that's a really important thing for the court to understand. And then also it's, well, he said, she said, how do I know the truth? And judges and prosecutors are not well-versed in a lot of, you know, honestly, family law attorneys are not well-versed in looking at who holds the power and control in a situation. And we have a great question in the chat. I'm going to answer that one. Does going no contact help or just escalate it further? And again, I have a therapist answer for that. It depends. It depends. And it's going to be unique to each situation. I think that sometimes going no contact can be really helpful. And we call it being a gray rock. And what do gray rocks do? They do nothing. They just rock. They sit there and they be a rock and they don't do anything. You can be a yellow rock, which is a pleasant rock. Yes, please, thank you. You know, thanks for letting me know, whatever. But you're still not engaging in any of that emotional banter. You're not engaging in their abusive behaviors. You're not getting baited in, if you will. And so sometimes going no or low contact can be very helpful. Sometimes that's really impossible because you have children. And sometimes I've seen this. I know, Tiffany, you've probably seen this as well, using systems that are meant to help document conversations like Our Family Wizard get weaponized, where they will say things or they will get the victim dysregulated and the victim will then respond in a way that isn't as helpful as it could be. Or they'll just send like a bunch of messages at all hours through Our Family Wizard. And maybe there's a parenting agreement that says that you have to respond within 24 hours and you've got 17 messages to respond to. And all of these different things. So you can't really go no contact in that space. You have to go limited contact, and you have to decide what kind of contact you want to have. And then also, this is one of the things that we say often to survivors and to victims is, you know your situation best. We don't want you to walk in fear. We want you to walk in empowerment, and we want you to have good safety plans and those sorts of things. But if you're like, man, if I go completely no contact, that will send my abuser over the edge, then we would advise you trust your gut, do the things that are going to keep you safe to the best of your ability, and have a robust safety plan. There are plenty of safety plan templates online. If you're like, I need a safety plan, and you're listening to us, your local domestic violence shelter, and if you're like, but this term violence, I don't know what to do with because I haven't been hit. He didn't hit me. And I'll just say, first of all, unless your brain can be taken out of your body and stuck in a jar, it is in fact an actual body part. Secondly, it releases all kinds of neurochemicals. So all abuse is physical abuse because it basically pickles you in your own juices because of our stress responses in our physiology. And so it's really, really important to understand that you do need a safety plan and that you have the ability to go to a domestic violence shelter even if you haven't been hit. There are many organizations that will help you write that safety plan. They will help you get an advocate, and you don't have to have been physically assaulted in the traditional, I hate this terminology, but I don't know how else to say it, traditional way, in order to get some support from your local domestic violence organization.
Right. And the purpose of tonight's discussion is not to scare anyone, right? This is obviously, this case is very scary. This case is gotten a lot of national attention. But I think that this case is also not typical, right? This is not something we are seeing on a daily or a weekly basis, to have like a decade-long absence from an abuser and then have him come in and suddenly kill both you and your husband so violently. Does it happen? Yes. Does it regularly happen? No. And so the purpose is not to scare you, but we do want to make you aware of behaviors of coercive controllers, because many women who are in abusive relationships don't recognize the signs of abuse. They don't realize or don't even know that they're in an abusive relationship, right? They kind of feel like there's something wrong, there's something off here. I don't feel good about the relationship that I'm in. I don't really like the way he behaves or treats me, but they don't understand that they're in a systematic pattern, cycle of abuse. And so the purpose is to educate you so that you can create a safety plan. You can contact support people. You can get yourself in I think we just lost Tabitha. Hopefully she will rejoin us. That you can get yourself in a situation where you are safe. So that is the purpose of our live tonight, not to scare anyone. And so, Tabitha, I wanted to talk a little bit. I'm going to add Dr. McKee back to our stage. So this is Dr. Michael McKee. He is the one who has been charged formally. So he was living in Illinois at the time of the murders, and the murders occurred in Franklin County, Ohio. So he traveled, I believe it was about 6 hours from where he was living in Illinois in order to carry out his intended plan. And he's been charged with 4 counts of aggravated murder. And then I believe it's 1 count of aggravated burglary. Let me just double check that. I don't want to tell the audience something that's wrong. It might be 2 counts of aggravated burglary. And then there's some firearm charges as well. But let's talk about the traits of abusers. Is there a typical profession or a typical income bracket or a typical way that abusers present?
No. I like to say that abuse is an equal opportunity offender. It does not matter your race, your ethnicity, your socioeconomic status, your country of origin, your religion. None of that matters. It doesn't matter if you're in a heterosexual relationship or a same-sex relationship. None of that matters, because abuse is just, it's power and control. So if one person decides they want power and control, that's the paradigm. And I think we do often think about abuse as being like, oh, those folks in trailer parks or in the inner city or whatnot. And I will say, in some instances, we may hear more reports in those places at times, but it's just because it's less hidden than in the mansions and the white collar places and the more affluent areas. So I think that was another shocking factor in this case, is that the accused, is a surgeon, and that takes a lot of time and brain power. I do not math enough to be a surgeon, I will tell you that. And also I have no desire to be one, but like it does, none of that matters in terms of coercive control. It really is that heart of entitlement. And again, it's an equal opportunity offender.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then let me put up on the screen, I actually have a copy of the indictment. So he was just indicted and charged. And I will put a link to the indictment in the chat. You can access it directly. But he has obtained counsel and he has pled not guilty. So if you're familiar with the case, you will know that on December 30th, in the wee hours of the morning, he did go into their residence. They have 2 small children, and he did shoot multiple times and kill both Monique and her husband, who's a dentist, Spencer Tepe, while their children were present in the home. Thankfully, he did not harm the children. So they are safe and have been placed in the care and custody of family members. So please be praying for their children and for their family. That is the least that we can do. And there has been a GoFundMe page that has been started for the Tepe family as well. So if you're interested in supporting domestic violence victims and their children and their family in that way, there is a GoFundMe page that has been established for them as well. But we're just getting started, right, on the formal charges and the trials and all of that to come. And more information, I'm sure, will be released as the trial takes place. But some of the other things that I wanted to talk about, Tabitha, is is it common for victims to be vocal about the domestic violence that they're going through? And how does that relate to the Tepe case?
Yes and no. So it depends, again, on the victim, and it depends on the circumstances. Sometimes people feel shame over the fact that they were in a coercively controlling relationship, and so they may not talk about it at all. Some may, have told everybody in their cat about it. Essentially, we do know from reports and from family statements from Monique that she did talk about being in an abusive marriage and that he had threatened to kill her. Those are statements that her family has said she made. So she was talking about it, but it wasn't something she would have shouted from the rooftops. I've yet to meet abuse victim in normal life that is shouting that from the rooftops. Now, people will tell their stories at survivor retreats. They'll tell them in contexts like this, and some people write books and things like that. And that's all, that's individual to the person. So some people are going to be more vocal about it. Some people are going to be less vocal. Oftentimes, especially if you are like, I'm out, I'm past it, I never want to think of that again, then they might not talk about it. They might not have those conversations and say, this is part of my story, because they just want to be done. And so there's not a right or wrong way to be a survivor of coercive control. So if you're like, well, my friend was in it and she doesn't talk about it, well, okay, your friend doesn't talk about it. That's up to her, or maybe my one friend talks about it a lot. Okay, that's up to them. So it really depends on the individual.
Yeah. And in this particular case, did it seem like at the beginning of the investigation that Monique had disclosed a lot of information about the abuse that she had been suffering from in her relationship with Dr. McKee?
It's not clear yet. There are some reports, like her brother-in-law has been interviewed. I've seen interviews with him where he said that she did mention it, but it doesn't seem, based again on just what's out there at this moment, that there was a lot said about it. There were some things said about it, probably more in private with family. It sounds like, I think at trial we will find out a lot more about it. because right now we have what media is reporting. And I don't know about you, Tiffany, but I know in high profile cases that I've been involved in, the media doesn't always get it right. They don't always, and it's not because they are at all malicious. I mean, some might be, but most aren't, are not malicious. It's that they don't understand what they're hearing, or we hear everything through our own filters. And so we don't always, regurgitate that correctly, in a news story, or we're trying to give it a title people will click on and whatnot. And so it's hard to know for sure. What will tell the tale is when it goes to trial and we have discovery and the evidence is presented to a jury, assuming it gets that far. Now, he could at some point take a plea and, plead guilty to some type of charge. I sincerely doubt that the Columbus Police Department will take a significantly low charge for this. I think it would still be some level of murder, but maybe the death penalty would be off the table. I don't know. I'm not sure if Ohio is a death penalty state at this point. But those are things that you might see happen, very much like the Brian Kohberger case, where he's not guilty. His attorney was a bulldog for him, as she should be. I know it's hard for people to hear, but we do want attorneys to zealously advocate for their clients. That is part of the ethic. And then when it was evident that, their motions were being denied, they were not winning their arguments, that he said, okay, I want the death penalty off the table. I'm willing to plead. And that happened literally days before trial was to begin. So we can see that. We see defendants plead to things in the middle of trial. And if the prosecutors are amenable to that, then they will do that. So it'll be hard to know. Hopefully, we will get additional information as this moves into the trial phase. That's also not going to be fast, and Tiffany, you can speak to this more than I can. Like, trials don't happen overnight.
No, they sure don't. They can take years. So, and it's my understanding that the defense attorney that he's hired is pretty good at what she does, and is also kind of a bulldog attorney, and is previously defended another high-profile physician who was acquitted on 14 murder charges in Columbus in 2022. And that was a case where he had excessively prescribed prescription drugs to his patients. It wasn't something where he actively went out and had killed 14 people. But I saw the arraignment hearing, and she looked pretty passionate about her. I was like, okay, we can calm down a little bit. We're just making a plea. I don't think we need to have like veins popping out of our neck and everything here. So I think she's going to be a fairly zealous advocate for him, and just hoping that if he in fact is the murderer, that she doesn't get him off on some technicality. I hope everyone does their jobs as they should be. That's what the system was designed for. And I think that they're taking this very seriously in Ohio. I'm hoping law enforcement's doing what they need to be doing to make sure there aren't any T's that go uncrossed or I's that do not go dotted.
Right. Absolutely.
So let's talk about one more thing before we close up, because our time is kind of getting short. Let's talk about like trigger points and escalation. Are there certain things that we see with coercive controllers that can cause them to escalate? What are some common trigger points that might cause an abuser to become violent or escalate the control in some way?
Yeah, I'm going to give you that therapist answer of it depends yet again, because each case is unique, and the individuals involved are unique. You can just be breathing, and and that is an escalation, right? You can not acquiesce to something that they have demanded of you, and that can lead to escalation. There are any number of things. There's some speculation in this particular case that for whatever reason, and you and I talked about this, Tiffany, when it came out, was that like the Ohio court system had moved to e-filing, and that vomited out all kinds of weird stuff, including putting this divorce hearing back out there when it was an error in scheduling and shouldn't have even been done. And so that could have done it. Maybe he's like, oh, now I'm doing this. And, and he was having some professional issues. He had been, allegedly attempted to be served a subpoena in a medical malpractice case, and he disappeared from his job in Las Vegas and turned up at his job in Illinois and that kind of thing. So he was unable to be served. it's really unclear like what might have done it here, and it's unclear at times what may or may not do it in other cases. I know I have heard stories of, abusive individuals not liking the pants that the minor child, that they share with the victim is wearing, and that's enough to escalate it. And
Mhm.
again, we try to apply logic to things that are illogical. And when you look at someone as property, and your property is not functioning the way that you would like it to, you get rid of it. The problem is that people are not property. They're image bearers of the living God, and they should be treated as such. But coercive controllers don't see it that way. And
Right.
so, they look at it like, oh, you're a car that has stopped driving, or a couch that is no longer comfortable. I'm going to get rid of you.
Mhm.
And any number of things can cause an escalation. My advice for folks who are listening who are like, well, ding dang, I thought I was out, is you're probably fine, but be wise, right? I personally would be mindful of, like using easy passwords, easy codes for things. If I had a smart TV or some other electronic object left over from my marriage, I might get a new one, honestly, if I'm able to, because these are ways that you can be stalked and things like that. So, just being wise, putting in appropriate, things to protect you, and then living your life, right? There was no way, at least at this point, that we could understand that this could have been predicted in Ohio. And so we don't know. We won't know again until it goes to trial, some more of those details. But wisdom is important, and taking good care and being wise, and then just living your life.
Yeah. No, I think that's good advice. We cannot constantly live in fear, right? We have to recognize the dangers, though. And I think one thing that we talked about before is like over functioning victims, right?
Mm-hmm.
We try to hide the abuse. We try to cover it up. We try to figure out ways to solve the problems on our own, rather than getting the help right now, rather than getting that protective order, rather than telling our support people around us, whether it's our new husband, our family members, our neighbors, our friends, look, I'm getting contacted by my ex-husband. He's dangerous. He's threatened to kill
Right.
me. Can we start a neighborhood watch? Maybe we need to install additional security. Maybe there are other measures that we need to put into place that will increase my protection rather than hiding that information. And I'm not saying this I'm not saying this to blame Miss Tepe for what happened to her in the least. I don't know what she did, and no victim is at blame for anything that happens to them, right? We're using this as a guide to what we can be doing to protect ourselves, right? Keeping information hidden or in silence increases abuse and increases risk to you. So we need to be talking about it with other people, even if it is embarrassing, because that creates a layer of insulation, a layer of protection around you. Maybe it keeps local law enforcement privy about what's going on, right? So they need to be on guard. And if worse comes to worse, you at least have a record in place so that if he does do some harm, they have got more evidence to use against him when the case does go to trial, so that he can't get off on, technicalities or whatnot. So, strength is survival, and it's telling your story. It's not living in silence, right?
Right.
Being silent is not strength. It's about speaking up. That is true strength. So we don't want you to be in silence. Okay.
And
Is there anything
I'll
else?
also I'll also just combat shame. A lot of
Mhm.
times survivors don't want to tell their new neighbors, like, hey, if there's a lurker, like, we need to call the police, because they feel like, I don't want to be a bother. I don't want to be a burden. I call that the B word. But once you see, you can't unsee. So if you tell your neighbors, like, hey, look, if there's anybody walking around the house, like, and it's not me or my husband or my kids, like, please call the cops. I've been threatened and that sort of thing. And I've had clients who have gotten out, they've moved into new places, and have been able to make relationships with their neighbors and said those things. I had one client tell me, I live across the street from a United States Marine, and he said, let him mess with me. And I thought that was really great, because then that person was watchful. They knew, like, hey, there's somebody here that needs a little bit of extra care potentially. And I think that can also help. And then that also then does give you the ammunition if they're showing up on your cameras, or if your neighbors are saying, hey, I saw this person out in front of your house. Now you can then document that, and then you can potentially get a protective order in some way. And look, yes, protective orders are a piece of paper, but they are protective. Sometimes that's enough for someone to stop messing with you. Sometimes it's something that law enforcement can then adjudicate, because now they can enforce something. So I know there's a mixed bag on that in the survivor community, because sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they feel like they're not, but they are the best thing we've got right now. And having neighbors that are looking out for you. And you might say, well, I don't know my neighbors. This is an excellent time to get to know our neighbors. And that doesn't mean you have to have Sunday dinner with them. I mean, maybe they're awesome. Maybe you want to have Sunday dinner with them. But when we know each other, it actually shows that it reduces crime in neighborhoods in general anyway. I remember years ago, I moved into what was a new neighborhood at the time. And there were, the two streets that we kind of lived on had an enormous number of single women, but also older people. So it was a really cool mixed bag of folks. And we looked out for each other. I knew all of my neighbors on both streets, and we would have cookouts and do all those kind of fun block party things and whatnot. But the biggest thing was, if something was odd, I was checked on. My one neighbor, one night the lights went out and my alarm was going off, but I didn't know that. And I was sleeping through the phone calls saying, hey, your alarm's going off, because the power was out. I couldn't hear the alarm. It wasn't happening in my house. And I hear this banging on my door, and I go down there in all of my, I've been asleep glory, with my hair all a mess and a lantern because the power's out. And I'm like, where'd the power go? And open the door, and it's the police department and my neighbor standing behind them. And the police were like, hey, are you good? And I'm like, I'm great. What's happening? And then they told me what was going on. And I looked at my phone. I had 8 missed calls from the alarm company and all that stuff. And he said, yeah, we were going to break down the store if you didn't come, because your neighbor said he knew you were home. Yeah. And it was just that gave me a lot of peace, because if something was going on, people would know. And so it is well worth knowing your neighbors when you're able to do that, and to disclose. You don't have to tell them all your business, but you can disclose, hey, if you see anybody, will you let me know? And will you call the police, if there's somebody that shouldn't be here? And neighbors will do good things. Most people are really good, and they want to help you.
Right. And remember, 1 in 3 women are victims or have been victims of domestic violence or sexual assault. So this is a more common problem than you realize, right? So that neighbor that you're talking to, or someone down the street or friend, may understand this more than you know, right? And we have a community of women, not just women, but the community at large, right, who's out there and wants to help, that wants to make sure that you and your children and your family are safe. So do not be afraid to ask for help.
And there are good men. There are really good men out there, right? So I just want to say that, especially if you've been in a coercively controlling relationship as a woman, and you're like, I don't know if there are good men. I'm a little concerned. There are good men, and there are good men that are likely around you that are willing to step up. And we see that time and again, in communities. And I think sometimes it is just taking that risk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Is there anything else, Tabitha, that you wanted to add about the Tepe case, or about the patterns of coercive control that we see through this investigation or this case that we haven't talked about before we sign off tonight?
I will say we're going to have to wait and see what happens with this case. I'm very curious for the evidence to come out. Will I be watching this trial if it is televised? Yes, absolutely. Gavel to gavel, as one does. I will say, if you want to hear a coercive controller, someone I'm very certain is probably a coercive controller, testify, there was just a case that finished up in Fairfax, Virginia. It was the Commonwealth versus Brendan Banfield, and he was accused of and convicted of murdering his wife and another person. The case is way too much to go into here. Google the au pair affair trial. It's the whole thing. And then hold on to your buttons, because it's a pearl clutcher. But he testified on his own behalf, and it was horrifying, disgusting, mind-numbing, and fascinating all at the same time. And you can hear his languaging when he talked about his deceased wife. And this was one of the things that stood out in my mind so much listening to that testimony this past week, was him saying, well, you know, their daughter, because they had a 4-year-old at the time, was really sad at the separation from her mother. Not the death of her mom, not her mom's passing, not the passing of my wife, the separation, which is such a depersonalization of another human being that you said you loved.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a whole thing. So like listening, first of all, his testimony is ridiculous and he's lying all the way through it, clearly. But if you want to hear what someone who really sees someone as property or as ancillary, how they testify, go watch that testimony. It's well worth your time.
Well, and I know I'm putting this picture back up here because I know there's been a lot of conjecture in social media about his nonverbal communication, his facial expressions. We've seen a lot of just kind of cold stares, flat affect, doesn't really seem to be very nervous in the videos and whatnot that they've been showing, which could just, you know, take it for what you will. I don't know how I would respond if I was booked for murder. I think I would probably be pretty nervous, probably pretty shaky, probably pretty emotional. But this is definitely, as a domestic violence attorney, what I will say is, you know, I go up against some of the worst abusers, and for the most part, they deny, they lie. And they really have no emotional affect in court, and they don't really have any empathy for the victims, and so that kind of fits that profile, right? They don't really care who they hurt, whether it's their wives, their children, any other bystanders. It doesn't really matter because it's all about them, right? How do I please myself? How do I pacify myself? So I just wanted to put this picture up there because this really, his facial expression here, just that complete stoic, non-emotional, flat affect is a lot of what we're seeing from him. And that's a lot of what I see in my cases with coercive controllers, or I see anger. Like I see them looking very, very angry in the courtroom setting, red face, veins popping out, that kind of thing. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Sometimes they also look real charming.
Yeah.
And they're affable. And, you know, one of the things I've said when I've co-facilitated batterer intervention and prevention groups is I would have a beer with most of them. I would marry absolutely none of them because they are affable at times. They are charming at times. They seem nice. Sometimes they're the pillar of the community, right? This guy was a surgeon and like not an easy surgeon. Vascular surgery is very specialized, you know, and yet he's accused of something incredibly heinous. And so two things can be true at the same time. Someone can come across affable and also be a monster at home. And so holding that tension is really important, and knowing what to look for in terms of coercive control. I'm a big believer in get educated. Once you see, you can't unsee.
Right. And if you're in that kind of relationship where you're, you know, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, husband is amazing one minute and the next minute he's, you know, hell on earth. You're like, what is happening here? Why is this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth? I'm so confused. I don't know what's going on. You're probably in an abusive relationship. And I'm not diagnosing because I'm not a therapist. And that's not
always right. It's always good to be curious. So if something doesn't feel right, just help. Ask questions. It never hurts to talk to a therapist, an attorney, or an advocate, and just say, my experience, what could this be, right? And sometimes it might be, hey, it's nothing, and sometimes it might be something. And so I always just encourage people and invite them into a curious stance about what they're noticing, and then go from there.
And I definitely highly recommend that you seek the advice of a therapist if you're worried that you might be in an abusive relationship. I also put the number for the National Domestic Violence organization on the screen. So please contact them if you need help. And then I also put up also on the screen womenslaw.org. You can go there. They give you resources for every single state in the United States. So they have domestic violence resources, domestic violence organizations, agencies, state laws, sheriff's departments, places where you can get help. Where you are, we encourage you to reach out. Where you live, if you feel like you need help, please do so. All right. Well, if you recognize patterns tonight that you've lived through, that doesn't make you biased. It makes you informed. The purpose of these conversations is not to create fear. We want to sharpen your discernment. We want to help survivors name what's real, document what matters, and protect themselves before harm escalates. You're not required to convince anyone of your reality in order to honor it. Tabitha, thank you for lending your expertise and compassion to this space. And to everyone watching, trust what you see, trust what you feel, and know that your truth is one of the most powerful tools that you have. Tabitha, I hope you'll join me back here when we get more updates on the Tepe case. I know we were talking about the John Paul Miller case and the federal stalking charges that he's under. It'll be interesting to see whether the federal stalking apply in this case as well.
Absolutely. Definitely looking forward to it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tabitha. And good night, everybody. Remember to like and subscribe so we can get this message out to more women who need to hear it. Thanks so much.